Hello, welcome back to Culturalism into Cultural Studies. This is our course in popular culture. So, I would like to continue discussing our material from last week's discussion about culture and civilization tradition. So, if last week we talked about how the ideas about culture in the late 1800s in UK was very pessimistic towards pop culture, and that was because of the social movements that happened at that time that made the people who are in power felt discomfort looking at how the social structures are changing or were changing at that time. So the depiction of pop culture became very bleak and pessimistic, and it was considered as a parasitic culture, as a residual culture. But you will see that this week, the view of pop culture is changing for a lot more optimistic view. So let's talk about the background. The theories that we're going to discuss in these chapters, it was actually developed in the 1950s and the 1960s. And there are key figures that represent this idea of culturalism, and those are Richard Hoggart, Raymond Williams, E.P. Thompson, Stuart Hall, and Paddy Warnell. So these are key figures of this time, and I do want you to be familiar with their work and to understand why they are so significant for the ideas about pop culture at that time. So both Hoggart and Williams developed their ideas in response to Leavisism. And we're going to talk more about Leavisism and talk about how these two key figures respond to the Leavisism's ideas. And they provide foundational theory for the emerging of cultural studies approach to pop culture. So for those who forget about this, but when we're thinking about cultural studies approach to pop culture, it's actually a very optimistic and very positive view of pop culture. It doesn't view it as a parasitic or residual culture. Instead, it provides a lot of agency to the people who create pop culture and who consume it as well. So let's talk about Richard Hoggart first. When we're talking about the uses of literacy, which is one of his foundational writing when it comes to analysis of pop culture, he wanted to address Leavisism ideas about working class culture. Well, Leavisism viewed working class culture consisted of the commodities produced by the culture industries. And therefore, all that was required to understand working class culture was an analysis of the commodities produced by the culture industries. But Richard Hoggart, through the uses of literacy, challenged this perspective. You cannot just understand working class culture by looking at the commodities produced by the cultural industries. So in his writing, Hoggart challenges the assumption that working class culture and mass culture are one and the same. According to him, there is a relationship between the two, but they are not the same. So working class culture is actively made from the consumption of a repertoire of texts and practices produced by the culture industries. So look at this. There is this difference. According to him, working class culture is actively made from the consumption of a repertoire of texts and practices produced by the culture industries. So by paying attention to how he words that, you will understand that, yes, a lot of the working class culture goes or went to consume movies that were produced by the cultural industries. But how they actually make meanings out of it. They're doing it actively. So they're not just being passively fed by these cultural industries. No, instead, they're actually taking active stance on how they make meaning out of it. So here it says that those who do sing or listen to these songs often make the songs better than they really are. People often read them, newspapers and magazines, in their own way, so that even there they are less effective than the extent of their purchases would seem to indicate. People are not living lives which are imaginatively as poor as mere reading of their literature would suggest. So by just paying attention to this, you can understand how Richard Hoggart put a lot of agencies on the people, on the working class people who actively consuming this culture that is produced by cultural industries. So underpinning this various claim is the idea of mass culture as a form of imposition, with working class culture as a form of resistance to it. So it's not just passively consumed without any kind of thoughts going into it. Instead, working class culture is actually a form of resistance to this idea of mass culture as a form of imposition. So, whereas the Leavisites condemn the products of the culture industries for what they do to those who consume them, in part 1 of the Uses of Literacy, Richard Hoggart locates the products in actual practices of consumption. And so, to put it simply, this is the difference between reading the impact of a commodity from the commodity itself and reading the impact of a commodity from how the commodity is consumed. So if you're taking the Leavisites' perspective, it may seem like the working class people, because they're not as cultured, and so they're not as from their perspective, they're not as cultured, and so they're not equipped with the ability to actually critically read the cultural products that they're being fed. The Leavisite think that these working class cultures, they're just passively consuming what have been produced for them. But Richard Hoggart was saying that no. It's because of how you stand in looking at this phenomenon that make you think that they're consuming it passively. But if you're looking at it from the perspective of the working class people, you will understand that they're not just merely consuming them. They're actually taking an active stance on how they consume the culture. So, I do have a quick questions as we're talking about this stand that Richard Hoggart was, insisting on. So he said that this is the difference between reading the impact of a commodity from the commodity itself and reading the impact of a commodity from how the commodity is consumed. Now, what I would like to do, you to do, is actually to think of an example of how this would look like. And you can actually use an example from the present day context if you would like to. Think about a popular culture that is produced by the cultural industries. So for instance, we can think about the Marvel movies, or we can think about the the Disney Studios movies or series, and view it as, when you view it from this Leavisite's perspective versus when you view it from Richard Hoggart's perspective. And you should be able to explain what does that mean that Richard Hoggart is actually saying. All right, I'm hoping that this explanation on the first part of the chapter will help you understand what it is that Richard Hoggart is trying to argue, and how the conversation is going on between his perspective versus the Leavisism. All right, thank you so much.